Have you ever looked at a map of East Asia and wondered, why is there a giant country called Mongolia right in the middle of China and Russia? It's a question that pops up a lot. It looks like it should belong to someone. And for centuries, many people assumed it did. The real story isn't about China absorbing Mongolia. It's about Mongolia breaking away at the exact moment history cracked open. This is a story of empires rising and collapsing, of Mongol rulers once conquering China itself, of revolutions, foreign armies, and global power deals made during world wars. Mongolia didn't just drift into independence, it fought, negotiated, voted, and survived intense pressure from much larger neighbors to become a country in its own right. So, how did a sparsely populated land walk away from one of the world's oldest civilizations and stay independent? To understand that, we need to rewind the clock to when the balance of power looked very different. Pull up a map of East Asia and your eyes almost always stop at the same place. China spreads across the screen, Russia looms above it, and right in between sits Mongolia, huge, empty, and oddly separate. It looks like a missing puzzle piece, a country with barely over 3.5 million people, yet more than 4 times the size of Germany, sitting between two global powers. But the map is misleading. Mongolia isn't a buffer zone or a leftover border mistake. It's a fully independent country with its own government in Ulaanbaatar, its own currency, military, and a seat at the United Nations. It runs its own foreign policy and maintains relations with almost every country on Earth. On paper, there's nothing ambiguous about it at all. So why the confusion? Because maps don't show history, and history is where things get complicated. For centuries, Mongolia and China were deeply entangled, not as equals, but as rulers and subjects at different times. The idea that Mongolia should be part of China comes from memories of empire, not from modern borders. What we are really seeing on the map isn't a strange exception, but the outcome of centuries of shifting power, collapsing dynasties, and unfinished arguments about who once ruled whom. To understand why Mongolia stands alone today, we have to go back to a time when the balance of power was completely reversed, when it was China that answered to the Mongols, not the other way around. In 1206, Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes and unleashed an empire that reshaped the world. Within decades, Mongol armies thundered across Asia and Europe. By 1271, his grandson Kublai Khan had conquered China itself and founded the Qing Dynasty. For nearly a century, China was ruled by Mongols, not Chinese emperors, but empires don't last forever. The Mongol Empire fractured, the Qing Dynasty fell, and Chinese rule returned. Centuries later, a new force rose from the northeast, the Manchus. By the late 1600s, the Manchu-led Qing Dynasty began absorbing vast territories to secure its borders. Between 1691 and 1758, Qing forces brought what we now call Outer Mongolia under their control. This wasn't colonization in the modern sense, but it wasn't equality either. Mongolia was administered as a frontier region, tightly regulated and deliberately kept separate from China proper. Han Chinese settlement was restricted. Local princes answered to Qing officials, and real power rested far from the steppe. For more than 200 years, Mongolia existed under Qing rule, politically subordinate but culturally distinct. This long Qing era is the foundation of China's historical claim. Later, Chinese governments would argue that because the Qing ruled Mongolia, it was part of China. But the Qing Empire wasn't a Chinese nation-state. It was a multi-ethnic empire. And when it began to collapse, everything holding it together began to unravel. And as the Qing weakened under internal crises and foreign pressure, Mongolia was quietly waiting for the moment when imperial control would finally break. By the early 1900s, the Qing Empire was coming apart. Corruption, foreign pressure, and internal rebellions had pushed it to the edge. In Mongolia, daily life was harsh, society was rigid, poverty was widespread, and resentment toward Qing officials had been building for years. When the center started to weaken, the frontier felt it first. Then came 1911. As revolution erupted in China and the Qing Dynasty collapsed, Mongolia's leaders moved fast. Mongolian nobles and Buddhist authorities expelled the Qing Amban from the capital and declared independence in December. They placed power in the hands of the Bogd Khan, creating a theocratic state and taking their first real step toward modern nationhood. But independence on paper didn't mean independence in reality. The new Republic of China immediately rejected the declaration and continued to claim Mongolia as its territory. For the next decade, Mongolia became a battleground for bigger forces. Chinese troops returned, Russian influence grew, and chaos followed. The turning point came in 1921. As civil war raged in Russia, Soviet forces crossed into Mongolia, backing local revolutionaries. Together, they pushed out Chinese occupation troops and defeated the brutal warlord Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, known as the Mad Baron. With Soviet support, a new people's government took control. After the Bogd Khan's death in 1924, the country was officially renamed the Mongolian People's Republic, becoming the world's second communist state. Mongolia now existed as a separate country, protected and heavily influenced by the Soviet Union, even as China continued to deny its loss. For 2 decades, Mongolia lived in this uneasy space, independent in practice, disputed in principle, until a global war forced the world's major powers to finally decide its fate. World War II is what finally settled Mongolia's status, not on the battlefield but at the negotiating table. In 1945, as the war neared its end, the leaders of the Allied powers met at the Yalta Conference. The Soviet Union agreed to enter the war against Japan, but Stalin had conditions. One of them was clear. The independence of Outer Mongolia had to be preserved. That single demand changed everything. For the first time, Mongolia's future was tied to a global power agreement backed by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Soon after, in October 1945, Mongolia held a nationwide referendum under Soviet supervision. The result was overwhelming. Every recorded vote supported independence from China. Facing both international pressure and a treaty with the Soviet Union, the Republic of China had little room to maneuver. In January 1946, Chiang Kai-shek's government formally recognized the independence of the Mongolian People's Republic. After decades of denial, Mongolia was now recognized as a separate state under international law. But recognition alone wasn't enough. Borders still mattered. For years, the exact boundary between China and Mongolia remained unsettled. That final step came in 1962, when Mongolia and the People's Republic of China signed a formal border treaty. After more than a year of negotiations, the agreement fixed a 4,677-kilometer frontier. In 1978, it was registered with the United Nations, locking the border into international law. From that point on, the question was no longer historical, it was settled reality. Mongolia was independent, its borders defined, its sovereignty recognized. Today, Mongolia walks a careful line between its 2 powerful neighbors, trading heavily with China while guarding its independence. Its existence isn't an accident of geography, but the result of timing, power, and decisions made when empires collapsed and the world was being reshaped.